Sometime in July, if everything currently being reported holds together, Prince Harry is planning to do something he hasn't done in 4 years. He's going to bring his wife and both of his children back to the United Kingdom, all 4 of them, together on British soil for the first time since the late Queen's Platinum Jubilee back in the summer of 2022. Archie will be 7 by then, Lilibet will be 5. Neither of them has any real memory of the country their father grew up in, the country he served in uniform, the country where their grandfather now sits on the throne. If this trip actually happens the way it's being described, it won't just be a nice family visit. It will be the visible result of years of legal fighting, quiet diplomacy, and a security standoff that has, at various points, looked completely unresolvable. To understand why this particular trip counts as Harry's latest and arguably biggest move, you have to understand everything that had to happen just to make it possible in the first place. The story really starts back in February of 2020, in the chaotic weeks right after Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from royal duties. Within days of that announcement, the body responsible for deciding who gets government-funded protection in Britain, known by the clunky acronym RAVEC, decided that Harry and Meghan's automatic police protection would end once their transition out of royal life was complete. What almost nobody outside a small circle of insiders understood at the time was that this decision skipped a step everyone assumed was mandatory. Normally, a dedicated risk assessment board is supposed to evaluate the actual threat level facing someone before a decision like that gets made. In Harry's case, no fresh threat assessment was ever carried out, not in 2020, and as it turned out, not for years afterward either. The justification given at the time was that his situation was simply too unusual, too unprecedented for the normal process to apply cleanly. That gap, a missing risk assessment sitting underneath one of the most consequential decisions of Harry's adult life, became the single thread he would spend years trying to pull on. What followed was a remarkably long, remarkably public legal campaign, almost unheard of for a member of the royal family, even one who had already stepped back from official duties. Harry first tried and failed to get permission to personally pay for armed police protection out of his own pocket when visiting the UK, a request the courts rejected in 2023 on the basis that private individuals simply aren't allowed to purchase that level of state security regardless of how much they're willing to spend. He then pursued a full judicial review of the original 2020 decision itself, arguing that the process behind it had been fundamentally flawed. The High Court dismissed that broader challenge in February of 2024. He appealed. In May of 2025, the Court of Appeal upheld the original ruling, concluding that whatever sense of grievance Harry felt about how he'd been treated, it didn't amount to a legally valid complaint. Harry's reaction to that loss, in an emotional interview given immediately afterward, was about as blunt as anything a senior royal has ever said publicly about the institution he came from, describing the outcome as an old-fashioned establishment stitch-up. For most people, losing at that level, after years of fighting, might have been the end of the road. For Harry, it turned out to be a pivot point rather than a dead-end dot. Instead of trying to relitigate a battle he'd already lost twice, Harry's team shifted strategy entirely. Rather than arguing the original decision had been unlawful, which the courts had now rejected twice, he focused on the one procedural gap that had never actually been addressed: the fact that no proper, up-to-date risk assessment of his security situation had ever been conducted in the first place. In December of 2025, he wrote directly and privately to the Home Secretary, requesting exactly that: a full, current evaluation of the actual threats he and his family face, separate from any argument about how the original decision had been made. That request landed at a moment when it was harder than usual to dismiss out of hand. Just months earlier, during one of his solo visits to London, a woman described by people close to him as a known stalker had managed to get within feet of him on 2 separate occasions in a single visit, an incident serious enough that it reportedly factored directly into how seriously his new request was taken. What happened next surprised a lot of people who had been following this saga for years. Rather than simply rejecting the request, the way Ravek had effectively done by inaction for half a decade, the body agreed to commission a brand new, comprehensive risk assessment, its first full review of Harry's situation since before he ever stepped back from royal life. Reports throughout January suggested the review was moving in a noticeably different direction than anyone expected, with multiple outlets describing the restoration of his protection as essentially a formality at that point, with one insider telling a British tabloid the decision was, in their words, nailed on. By June, reporting out of Westminster described Harry's bid to regain that protection as poised to become reality, language about as close to a confirmed outcome as anyone reports before an official announcement actually drops. To really understand how unusual this entire fight has been, it helps to understand what Ravek actually is, since most people outside Britain have never heard the term before this saga made it a regular fixture in royal headlines. The Royal and VIP Executive Committee sits inside the Home Office and brings together senior figures from the police, the intelligence services, and the royal household itself to make joint decisions about who receives state-funded protection and at what level. It isn't a court, it isn't elected, and its decisions are largely discretionary, which is exactly why Harry's legal challenges kept running into the same wall again and again. Judges repeatedly found that even if Harry felt mistreated by the process, the committee had broad legal authority to make exactly the kind of judgment call it made, and courts are generally reluctant to second-guess that sort of discretionary security assessment unless the actual process behind it was clearly broken. That's precisely why Harry's pivot toward focusing on the missing risk assessment rather than re-arguing the original decision itself turned out to be the more productive path. It wasn't asking a court to override the committee's judgment. It was asking the committee to actually do the basic procedural step it was supposed to have done years earlier and never had. None of this has happened without considerable public criticism, particularly around the question of who should be paying for any of it. Harry and Meghan have built a notably lucrative post-royal career since 2020, including a multi-year content partnership with Netflix, a successful lifestyle and food brand Meghan launched called As Ever, and substantial earnings from Harry's own best-selling memoir, all of which has left commentators openly questioning why British taxpayers should fund armed protection for a couple with a combined net worth reportedly in the tens of millions, particularly at a moment when ordinary households across the country are dealing with a genuinely difficult cost of living squeeze. Supporters of restoring his protection counter that private security firms simply aren't legally permitted to carry firearms or access the same real-time intelligence networks the Metropolitan Police can draw on, meaning no amount of personal wealth can actually substitute for state-level protection against the kind of credible documented threats Harry's legal team has presented. It's a genuinely difficult question with no easy answer, weighing personal wealth against the basic principle that the state has a duty of care toward any citizen, however famous or financially comfortable, facing a verified, serious risk to their life. Royal commentators have also pointed out, somewhat uncomfortably, that there's a deeper historical pattern at play here, one that stretches back nearly a century to the most famous case of a senior royal leaving institutional life behind. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, the crown maintained meaningful leverage over him for the rest of his life, largely because he depended on a private allowance from his family to maintain his lifestyle in exile. That financial dependence gave the institution real, lasting power over how he behaved and how visibly he stayed out of British public life. Harry, by contrast, walked away from royal life with no comparable dependence on continued family money, having built an entirely separate, self-sufficient income through his own commercial ventures. That difference matters enormously to how this entire standoff has played out. The institution simply doesn't have the same kind of quiet financial leverage over Harry that it once had over previous royals who tried to step outside its boundaries, which may help explain why this dispute has had to be fought out so publicly through courts and press statements rather than resolved quietly behind closed doors the way royal exits were traditionally managed in earlier generations. There quotes also a wider, slightly uncomfortable backdrop to this entire security conversation that rarely gets mentioned directly, but clearly shapes how seriously officials are now treating it. Earlier this year, in the same general period that Harry's renewed security request was working its way through review, his uncle Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, already stripped of his royal titles following his own scandal, was reportedly the target of an attempted attack, an incident that appears to have sharpened official thinking across the board about just how real and immediate threats against this particular extended family can actually become. Commentators following the security review closely have suggested that incident, regardless of how directly or indirectly it factored into Harry's own case, reinforced an argument his side had already been making for years. That fame and family connection to the crown create a level of personal risk that doesn't simply disappear the moment someone steps back from official duties, and that pretending otherwise, as the original 2020 decision arguably did, leaves real people exposed to real danger in the meantime. It quotes worth pausing on why this particular fight matters so much more than it might first appear. This was never really just about Harry's personal comfort or convenience. According to people close to him, the entire reason Meghan and the children hadn't set foot in Britain in 4 years wasn't simply scheduling or distance. It was a direct, deliberate decision tied entirely to security. Harry has said publicly more than once that bringing his family to the UK without proper protection simply wasn't something he was willing to risk, regardless of how much he personally wanted his children to know their father's home country, regardless of how much he wanted them to spend time with their grandfather. Every other consideration, reconciliation, scheduling, public appearances, all sat downstream of this one unresolved security question. Solve that, and an enormous number of other things suddenly become possible. Leave it unresolved, and almost nothing else can move forward, no matter how much goodwill might otherwise exist on either side. Running in parallel with this entire security battle has been a second, equally significant legal front, one Harry has been fighting not against the government, but against the British tabloid press itself. Over the past several years, he has taken on 3 of the country's largest newspaper groups directly through the courts, accusing them of decades of unlawful information gathering, phone hacking, bugging, and using private investigators to dig up details about his life that should never have been accessible to anyone outside his closest circle. He won a significant victory against the publisher of the Daily Mirror in 2023, with a judge concluding the company had engaged in what was described as widespread and habitual phone hacking. The following year, Rupert Murdoch's tabloid publisher made an almost unprecedented public apology and agreed to substantial damages to settle a similar case before it ever reached trial. The final and most ambitious of these battles against Associated Newspapers, publisher of the Daily Mail, went to trial at the start of this year, with Harry testifying for the second time in his life from a witness stand, something no senior royal had done in well over a century before he broke that particular tradition himself a few years earlier. That trial, which ran for roughly 10 weeks, and wrapped up at the end of March, was, by Harry's own account, never really about the money. He testified that the newspaper's reporting over the years had made him feel, in his words, paranoid beyond belief, describing a pattern of stories that seemed to know far too much about his private life and personal relationships to have come from any legitimate source. Associated Newspapers has firmly denied every allegation, calling the entire case a collection of preposterous smears and arguing that their stories came from legitimate sourcing rather than anything resembling the unlawful methods Harry's lawyers described. The presiding judge made clear at the close of the trial that his written judgment would take considerable time to prepare, telling the courtroom he intended to work on it essentially full-time after a short break, with a final ruling still expected at some point later this year. Whatever the outcome, the symbolism of the fight itself has already become part of how Harry frames his own post-royal life, less about chasing headlines and more, in his telling, about forcing accountability onto institutions that spent decades treating his family's privacy as something they had no real obligation to respect. While both of these legal battles were grinding forward, something quieter and arguably more emotionally significant was also happening behind the scenes. Last autumn, Harry traveled to the UK and reunited with his father for the first time in 19 months, sharing what was described as a private afternoon tea at Clarence House, King Charles's London residence. It wasn't a grand photographed public event, no balcony wave, no official statement dissecting every detail. It was, by most accounts, simply a father and son spending time together after a long and difficult stretch of estrangement, at a moment when Charles's own health situation has reportedly made both men more conscious than ever of how much time they actually have. Harry himself addressed that directly in an interview earlier this year, saying plainly that he would love reconciliation with his family, that there was no point continuing to fight, and that he genuinely didn't know how much longer his father had. Royal commentators have repeatedly pointed to that single comment as one of the clearest, most unguarded windows into what's actually driving this entire chapter of Harry's life, a son trying to rebuild a relationship with his father before time makes that rebuilding impossible. What quote is noticeably absent from almost every version of this unfolding reconciliation story is any meaningful movement between Harry and his brother. Multiple reports describing the upcoming July trip have specifically noted that no meeting between Harry and Prince William is currently planned, with one source close to the family describing the situation bluntly, saying there's simply no communication between them at the moment. That's a sharp, telling contrast to how things appear to be developing with Charles. Royal author Omid Scobie and others who cover the family closely have suggested Harry remains frustrated by what he sees as William's continued unwillingness to take any real accountability for how their relationship deteriorated, while William, for his part, is widely understood to harbor deeper, more entrenched resentment over how publicly the Sussexes have discussed the family's private business in recent years in interviews, in documentaries, and in Harry's own best-selling memoir. Whatever is genuinely thawing between Harry and his father does not appear, at least for now, to be extending across that particular relationship at all. There, quote, S, also a very practical, professional reason behind the timing of this trip that has nothing to do with family politics directly. Next summer marks the lead-up to the Invictus Games Birmingham, the international sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women that Harry founded over a decade ago and has remained closely involved with ever since. This July's visit is expected to include a series of engagements tied directly to marking the one-year countdown to that tournament, giving Harry a clear, entirely legitimate professional reason to be back on British soil, regardless of whatever family reconciliation might also be happening alongside it. It's worth noting that this overlap isn't coincidental or accidental. Throughout his post-royal career, Harry has consistently used Invictus-related work as one of the few channels through which he can return to public life in Britain on terms that feel entirely his own, built around a cause he started himself rather than one inherited through birth. Separate from the family apparatus, he spent years trying to define himself outside of . It's worth remembering, too, just how far back the roots of this entire standoff actually go, well before any court case or security review entered the picture. When Harry and Meghan first announced their intention to step back in January of 2020, senior royals gathered for a famously tense, hastily arranged meeting at Sandringham to work out the terms of that departure, reportedly including an agreement that some form of security would continue during a roughly 12-month transition period. According to Harry's own later account, the actual experience on the ground looked considerably less generous than that arrangement suggested, with his head of security informing him directly, only weeks later, that protection was simply being withdrawn. Harry has said that when he called his brother for help understanding what was happening, William told him it was a government decision, and nothing could be done about it. A response Harry's camp has since suggested wasn't quite the full picture, since later disclosures revealed the royal household itself held a seat at the very committee making that decision. Whether William fully understood the nuances of that arrangement at the time remains disputed, but the episode has become, for Harry, one of the clearest examples of exactly the kind of institutional failure he says he's been fighting against ever since. A system that talks about family loyalty while leaving him and his young family to navigate a sudden, serious security gap, essentially on their own. Meghan quote's own parallel public reemergence over the past couple of years adds an important piece of context to why this particular summer feels like such a natural moment for the family to finally return together. After a period of deliberately lower-profile living following the move to California, she spent the last 2 years steadily rebuilding a public-facing career entirely on her own terms, launching her lifestyle and food brand to commercial success, returning to television production work, and giving a handful of carefully chosen interviews discussing both the challenges of her early royal years and her hopes for a more settled, stable next chapter for her family. That steadier footing matters here because it suggests this trip isn't being driven by any sense of financial necessity or external pressure, but rather by a couple who have spent years building independent lives and careers, finally reaching a point where they feel secure enough, professionally and personally, to bring that independent life back into direct contact with the institution they once belonged to, on whatever limited terms that contact is currently possible. It's also worth noting how differently this entire saga has played out compared to how the institution traditionally prefers to handle disputes involving its own family members. For generations, disagreements within the royal family were managed quietly through private conversations, behind closed-doors negotiations, and carefully worded joint statements designed to present a united front, regardless of how much tension actually existed underneath. Harry's decision to fight nearly every part of this dispute publicly, through the courts, through television interviews, through his own memoir, represents a genuine break from that tradition, one that has clearly frustrated parts of the institution, even as it has, somewhat ironically, produced exactly the kind of concrete, documented outcome that quiet, private negotiation rarely delivers. Whatever else people think of his approach, the public, procedural nature of his fight means that, unlike so many royal disputes that fade quietly into rumor and half-confirmed reporting, this one has left behind an unusually clear paper trail, court rulings, written judgments, and a documented timeline of exactly what happened and when, that historians and journalists will be able to examine directly for decades, rather than relying purely on competing, unverifiable accounts from people who were in the room. Step back and look at everything happening at once, and a clear pattern starts to emerge that goes well beyond any single security ruling or any single court case. Harry has spent the better part of 6 years running what amounts to a sustained multi-front campaign to force change onto institutions that, in his view, repeatedly failed to protect him and his family, fighting the government over security, fighting the press over privacy, and separately, quietly, working to repair what could be repaired within his own family before time runs out on that particular relationship entirely. Each front has moved at its own pace, with its own setbacks and its own breakthroughs, the security fight dragging through years of losses before finally bending in his favor, the press battles producing a mix of clear victories and one final outstanding verdict still being written, and the family relationship improving with his father while remaining essentially frozen with his brother. None of these threads exist in isolation from each other either. The renewed security clearance, if it's finalized the way recent reporting suggests, doesn't just allow Harry to visit Britain more easily, it specifically unlocks the part of this story that seems to matter to him most right now, the ability to actually bring his children into the country and let them meet their grandfather in person, rather than continuing to manage that relationship entirely through video calls and the occasional brief security-limited solo trip. That, quote, really what makes this particular move, the planned July visit, qualify as something bigger than just another item on a long list of royal headlines. It represents the convergence point of nearly every separate battle Harry has been fighting since 2020, finally lining up at roughly the same moment. The security question that has defined and constrained almost everything else about his relationship with the UK appears to be resolving in his favor after years of expensive, painful legal defeat. The reconciliation with his father, something that seemed genuinely uncertain not long ago given how publicly bitter things had become, appears to be progressing steadily, even as the relationship with his brother remains stalled exactly where it's been for years, and the professional commitments tied to Invictus give him a clean, sympathetic reason to be back in the public eye on his own terms, doing work connected to wounded veterans rather than work connected to royal duty he no longer holds. None of this means the larger story is anywhere close to finished. The written judgment in the Mail case still hasn't been delivered, and depending on which way it lands, it could either reinforce Harry's broader narrative about institutional failure or hand his critics a significant, embarrassing setback after years of legal fighting. The formal, official confirmation of restored security has, as of now, still not been publicly announced in full detail, even with reporting describing it as close to certain, and anyone who has followed this particular saga for the past several years has learned to treat the word certain with at least some caution until the actual paperwork is signed, and whatever warmth currently exists between Harry and his father offers no guarantee at all about whether the far colder relationship with William will ever meaningfully change, no matter how many family trips happen in the meantime. What's clear, regardless of how each of those open threads eventually resolves, is that Harry's approach to all of it has been remarkably consistent from the very beginning. Rather than waiting quietly for the institution to come around on its own timeline, he has spent years applying pressure on every front simultaneously, legal, public, and personal, betting that eventually enough of those pressure points would give way at once to make the thing he's wanted most this entire time finally possible, bringing his whole family home, even if only for a visit, while there's still time for it to mean something.